Hello, my name is Tom DuPont. I'm with CodeSmith Tools, and today I'm going to be going over CodeSmith project files, or CSPs. Simply put, CodeSmith project files allow you to generate multiple templates at the same time. But they don't just stop there. They also add many features that allow you to better control and customize your batch of templates. So let's get started by opening up CodeSmith Studio and creating a CSP. So the first thing I'm going to do here before I even do that is just create another C# template, just a default new template, so we can have multiple ones to play with. Now, we're just going to right-click on our folder, just do New, CodeSmith Project, and I'm just going to call this one Project. Now, if we right-click and Manage Outputs, we're going to get our CodeSmith Project Manage Outputs window, and this is where most of the work is going to get done. So let's start with the base functionality of just adding a template to our project. So we're going to come here and click the Add Output button. Now let's go over this step by step. The first thing you can do here is you can add a name to the output for your CSP, or if you choose not to, it will take on the name of whatever template you specify. So let's come down here and choose our template. Now the drop down here will show any other templates that are currently in your CSP, and since we have no outputs right now, it's blank. So if we open this up, I'm just going to pick the new template we just created a moment ago. So you'll notice that now this has been auto-populated with the properties for that template. And down below, we can choose the file we want to output this template to. Now we can either use the default file name, which is going to be specified by the template. In this case, it's the template's name, then a suffix of its output type. Or we can specify the file name. So let's just go ahead and do that, show it can be done. And we'll name it new template 123 instead of new template 1. So beneath that is the merge strategy pane. Now, I'm not going to talk about this in this particular video because we have a video called Merge Strategies dedicated to this specific subject, so if you have any questions or want to know how that works, please refer to that video. So moving along to our property pane here, this is the standard property pane that you've seen before in CodeSmith Studio or in actually controlling templates when you just run them. So we're going to set any properties in this. So let's just set this to false to change something. And of course, you can save these values, load values, copy and paste them, or reset them, etc. And this is all template functionality. So let's add that template to our project. And voila, we now have a CodeSmith project file ready to be used with a template in it. So if we save this, we can go outside and run it. But before we do that, let's just take a look at some of the other options we have up here real quick. First of which is the Edit Output tab. So if we click that, we can go right back into our output window. Then we have the ability to copy output. So we can make a copy and make another copy of that copy. And if we edit that, we'll notice it's all the same settings. We change that to false. It's using a different file name now because we've copied it, so it's smart enough to add copy in front of it. Then we also have delete output, so we can delete. Then we have the ability to run a selected output or generate all the outputs, which is the point of the CSP. And then we have the project options. But before we get into that, let's take a look at what running these will do. So first I want to generate the CSP from outside of itself, and then we'll go back into the Manage Outputs window and do it. Now, running this is pretty straightforward and simple. First of all, when you right-click, three specific options for the CSP are Manage Outputs, Generate Outputs, and Add Outputs. And we just saw the Add Output a moment ago from inside the CSP Manager. So if we right-click, and this time, instead of running to Manage, we do Generate Outputs, it's going to run both of the templates that are inside of it. And of course, we have details and what have you for the templates. Now, if we open up the two outputs, we'll notice that aside from the file names, they're identical because we copy the templates and copy their settings. So again, I hope I showed that that's pretty simple to do. Just right-click and generate, and everything that's configured inside is going to work. So if we go back in and we do Manage Outputs, if we generate outputs from here, it's going to do the exact same task. So again, we have our progress meter. Again, the two outputs have come up, and again, they're the same. So if we come in here, and last little thing, if we just choose to run one of them specifically to generate the selected output, it's going to generate one, it's going to skip the others. So in this case, skipped one. Sure enough, there it is again. So again, on the surface, CSPs should be Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. But now I want to dive into the project options here, and I want to show you some of the more advanced things that we can do to help with more complicated tasks. So first I want to go through this step by step and describe what each thing does, and then afterwards I'm going to tie it all together and we're going to use an example using most of these properties. So first of all, there is a default template that you can specify for your CodeSmith projects. So when you open the sub, you can just pick any template you want, and then when you create a new output for that project, it will default to that template unless you specify otherwise. So pretty simple option. The next one is the project output option. We could do multiple files or single file. So by default, it's multiple files, and what that means is that each one of your templates in your project, each output, is going to generate its own file. However, in single file mode, you can have it all generate into one file. So it'll take the output of each template, or each output in your system, and append them all together and put it out into one file, which you would specify the file name here. Now this has two additional options to it. You can add a header, so what's going to go at the front of that file, and you can add a footer, so what's going to go at the bottom of that file. So that way, when you have a header and a footer, if you wanted to generate one template that's going to generate classes, and you wanted them all to be in one big file, you could specify your using statements and namespaces, put all your outputs in the middle, and then, the closing brackets to end it, which is what we're going to do a little later. Next, we have two checkboxes down here. We have the convert to relative paths on save, and this is only referring to the CodeSmith project. Anything inside the template is going to be outside of the domain of this logic, but this means that whenever you specify something, so say I were to type in C:\/ here, this would go through anything in the project file. It would convert all of its paths to be relative paths to the project. And then stop on error. And stop on error is going to, do what it says. It's going to stop on error. So if you have 100 outputs, or 100 templates, 100 outputs in your CSP, if number 1 throws an error, then we don't want to run the next 99. This is very useful when dealing with errors that involve connection strings, because rather than waiting for each connection string's timeout, it'll just stop where it gets the error. So now let's move on to the next tab, default properties. Now, this is what it sounds. Every template has properties that you can create, customize, whatever in the templates. This is going to set defaults for those properties that will override the actual template's default. So in our base template, we have a sample boolean and a sample string. In this, if I were to recreate sample boolean, and I believe it defaults to true in the new templates, like the one we created earlier, I can set this to false. And whenever I add any template that has that as a property in it, it will automatically set that to false by default. Now you can change that, but it's just going to override the defaults. And last but not least, we have our variables tab. And this is a little more complicated. What this is going to do is it's going to search for values in any of your properties, and if there's values that match what you specify here, then it's going to, in the CSP, in the configuration, it's going to save that value to a variable, so that if you were using the same value, again, with the example of 100 templates 100 times, that value is only going to be put into the CSP once, which would make it a little easier for editing going forward. A good example of this is if you have a connection string for your database. If each template has to have the connection string put in each time, there's going to be 100 copies of it in your CSP. And if you have to change one, then you probably want to change them all. So you come in here, you give it a value and a name, and anything that gets inserted in the CSP that matches that is going to be replaced with the variable you specify. So if you change this variable, it'll change all of them. And that sounds a little bit complicated. I'm probably not doing the best job explaining it, but we'll see an example in just a moment. So let's hop out of here and let's go look at our file mode template, which is what we're going to use to give a good example of all those features. Okay, so looking at this template, this should be pretty simple. We've got 3 properties up here: single file mode, which is a boolean; class name, which is a string; connection string, which is a string. The single file mode is, if you remember in our CodeSmith project properties, we had the multiple file mode versus single file mode. Well, if it was multiple file mode, we would want each file to be able to compile on its own, so we'd want to give it using statements and namespaces. If it was single file mode, we wouldn't want these to appear, because we would only want to get the class, and then our header and our footer would take care of these. So that's what that boolean is being used for. And then it's just a class name, which is a string, that's just getting appended to my and whatever you put here as the public class. And we have the connection string property. We're not actually using it here, but we have it because I'm going to show how to set a CodeSmith variable with that. So you notice this defaults to false in single file mode, just a class and a little string here. So if we generate this, or let me just hit play, it just yields a very, very, very simple output. So now that we've seen that, let's go into our project file, or heck, let's create a new project. We'll call this the file mode project. Open that up. Go back into our properties. So the first thing, let's set this file mode as our default template. And we want this to be a single file, so. And I'm going to also make this file mode CS, which is actually the default file name for the template itself. So we want to edit our header here, because remember, if we're using a single file, we're not going to get our using statements in the top, which is what we want. And then we want each template just to output its class. So we want our using statements and namespace start as a header, and then our footer is just simply a end curly bracket for the namespace. Now this demo is not going to be using either of these, because we're not going to be having any non-relative paths, and we shouldn't get any errors. But let's go ahead and stop on errors if we do get them. Now in default properties, you notice we have a single file mode property that is defaulting to false. Well, in this case, that's obviously going to be true, because we want to run in single file mode with this project, so we want the templates to know that. So we're going to set this value to true. And then I will come back and talk about the variables in a moment. So with all that configured, let's add a new output. Notice that our default file mode has come up, and our single file mode is now defaulted to true, even though if we look in the background here, it should be defaulting to false, but our override is working very well. So let's just add that as is. Let's go ahead and copy it. Let's make it 3 times. If we edit this, just change the class name, or class B, class C, and for the sake of consistency, let's make this class A. Now, if we run this, well, first let me point out actually that if we run one of these by clicking the generate selected outputs, it's going to still use the project's settings. So notice in the background here we have namespace, template namespace, and I should have pointed out when I copied it in, but our header is actually project namespace. So if we come in here and we generate this one output, it's going to run with the properties of the project. So notice, run successfully. If we open this up, this says project namespace. So it looks very similar to what we see here, but this was generated by the template. This was indeed generated by the project. So that's important to note, that the settings will be run even if you run a single output in a project. So now if we come and we run all of them, and yes, we want to refresh our file. If we notice what happened in the background right here, that template got run 3 times, and each time it outputted this. And our header and footer were added properly, so we get a nice, neat output. So the last thing left to discuss here is the project variables. So to narrate this, I'm going to go ahead and open up the CSP in, wrong one. Open up the CSP in Edit, so we can actually look at the HTML behind this. Now you'll notice that for each, these are our 3 templates that we have in here. For each property set, we have a connection string property with, in this case, the default was data source equals something. As you can see, this is in here 3 times. So 3 is not a bad number, but if you started getting big, that would be in there a whole lot. So if you need to change it, you have to come in here and literally do a find replace or change on each template, neither of which are that desirable. But if we go in, let's close this, we go into the project, we go into settings, go into our variables. If we specify the value that we want to replace with the variable, which in this case is our connection string, CodeSmith will go ahead and find it and replace all these with whatever we decide to name this. So I'm going to just name it con string var, so connection string variable. So now that that's in there, let's go back and look at this in edit mode. Notice that now all these are variables. And that variable is defined up here. So if you wanted to come in and change all your connection strings, well, obviously you could open this file and do it again manually, but the point is that you could come in, manage your options, go to your variables, and name this something else, if I could type. And when you come look at that again, it's been changed to something else here. All these variables are still there, and in the outputs themselves, notice it is now something else. So I believe that concludes this video over CodeSmith project files. I hope I'm able to show that whether you're doing simple operations or complicated operations, the CodeSmith project files provide flexibility to accomplish whatever you need to do with ease. So I hope overall you just found this to be informative and helpful. I also hope you enjoyed my using the words outputted and HTML to refer to XML. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for other videos, please visit us at community.codesmithtools.com. My name is Tom DuPont, and thank you for using CodeSmith.